Ready or not, summer is coming, and Wayfair's Memorial Day clearance is on now. Right now through May 25th, get up to 70% off everything home at Wayfair. Plus, score amazing doorbuster deals all sale long and surprise flash deals on Memorial Day. We're talking thousands of products at every style and budget. Now is the time to save big on must-haves for your patio, backyard, and beyond. These savings won't last, so don't wait. Shop Wayfair's Memorial Day clearance now through May 25th.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
Welcome back. So far in this series, I have argued that portfolio management becomes much more understandable when we stop treating it as a purely rational machine. In the first episode, I suggested that the best project does not always win because projects compete not only through value, but through sponsorship, visibility, timing, and narrative strength. In the second episode, I explored the difference between the portfolio you say you have and the portfolio you actually run, and how hidden work, interruptions, and underrepresented demand distort the official picture. In the third episode, I talked about zombie projects and portfolio debt, and the way old commitments can continue to shape the future long after their original case has weakened. In this episode, I want to take up one of the most familiar and respected phrases in portfolio management: strategic alignment. It is one of those phrases that sounds almost unquestionably, oh, good. Of course, projects should align with strategy. Of course, the portfolio should reflect strategic direction. Of course, organizations should not spend time and money on initiatives that are disconnected from where they say they are going. All of that is true. And yet, I think strategic alignment is one of the most overused and under-examined ideas in the whole portfolio space. Not because strategy is unimportant, it is extremely important, but because in many organizations, the phrase strategic alignment does less real work than people imagine. It often sounds sharper than it behaves. It appears to discriminate between proposals, but in practice it may mostly legitimize proposals that were already gathering support for other reasons. It gives the impression of disciplined strategic choice, while sometimes functioning more as a language of justification than a mechanism of selection. That is what I mean by strategy becoming theater. Now, theater is a strong word, so let me be careful. I do not mean that all strategic language is fake, or that organizations are simply pretending to have direction. Strategy is real. Strategic intent is real. Leaders do make choices about what matters. Priorities do shift. Investments do reflect direction. But there is still a theatrical risk here. The risk is that the language of strategy becomes so broad, so flexible, and so rhetorically useful that almost any project can be made to appear aligned. When that happens, strategy stops functioning as a meaningful filter and starts functioning as a performance of seriousness. Most people who have worked around portfolios for a while will recognize this. Nearly every proposal says it supports strategy. A digital service initiative improves customer experience, so it is strategic. A data quality initiative strengthens decision-making, so it is strategic. A modernization effort reduces technical fragility, so it is strategic. A compliance-driven change protects legitimacy, so it is strategic. A local operational improvement increases efficiency, so it is strategic. A new reporting solution supports control, so it is strategic. An AI experiment signals future readiness, so it is strategic. Soon, almost everything is strategic, which means the term begins to lose its ability to help with difficult choices. And that is the first problem. Strategic alignment often sounds discriminating, but many strategy frameworks are too broad to discriminate well in practice. Think about the language many organizations use in their strategy documents. Improve customer value, strengthen digital capability, increase efficiency, build resilience, support innovation, improve collaboration, enable data-driven decision-making, enhance service quality, strengthen compliance and security, modernize infrastructure, become more agile, create sustainable growth. There is nothing wrong with these ideas. In fact, many of them are entirely reasonable. The problem is that they are often broad enough that almost any competent proposal can attach itself to one or more of them. And once that happens, the strategic test becomes weak. Instead of asking whether a project truly represents the best use of scarce capability relative to strategy, governance begins asking whether a plausible strategic sentence can be written about it. Those are very different standards. One is hard, the other is easy. So let me put the issue plainly. In many organizations, strategic alignment is not hard to claim. It is mostly hard to challenge. And that matters because if almost every project can be made to sound strategic, then strategy is no longer selecting. It is decorating. This is especially common when strategy is translated into categories or themes that are intentionally inclusive. Organizations often want strategy to unify rather than exclude. They want it to mobilize people. They want it to create shared language. They want departments and teams to feel that their work contributes to larger aims. That is understandable and often useful, but it creates a structural problem for portfolio governance. The broader and more affirming the strategy language becomes, the less likely it is to force uncomfortable trade-offs. And yet, trade-offs are exactly what portfolios exist to make. So one of the central tensions here is that strategy often needs to be broad enough to guide the organization, but portfolios need criteria sharp enough to choose among competing initiatives. Many organizations do not manage that tension very well. They take broad strategy language and assume it will perform precise filtering work. Then they are surprised when every business case appears aligned. There is also a timing issue. In theory, strategy should shape project selection. In practice, it often works in reverse. Support for a project begins to form for other reasons. Urgency, sponsorship, visibility, local need, political pressure, executive preference, available funding, or institutional momentum. Then once the initiative is moving, people attach strategy language to it. The project is not selected because it emerged cleanly from strategy. It is described as strategic because strategic language helps stabilize support. Again, this is not always dishonest. Often it is simply how organizations translate concrete work into legitimate institutional terms. But it does mean that strategy is sometimes functioning more as post hoc justification than as prior discipline. And once you see that, you begin to notice a familiar pattern. Portfolio discussions often sound as though strategy is driving the room, but in reality, the room may already be leaning in certain directions for other reasons. Strategy then enters as a way of making those directions look coherent, principled, and institutionally appropriate. This is why I think the phrase alignment can be a little misleading. It suggests a clean relationship between two stable things, strategy on one side and projects on the other, as if strategy exists in clarified form and projects can then be neatly assessed according to how well they fit. But in real organizations, both sides are more fluid than that. Strategy itself may be broad, evolving, internally contested, or unevenly understood. And projects are not neutral objects either. They are narrated, framed, sponsored, and interpreted. So alignment is rarely a purely analytical judgment. It is often a negotiated one. This becomes especially visible in portfolio meetings when multiple projects all claim strong strategic relevance. Imagine a portfolio board reviewing 4 initiatives. One improves customer-facing digital services. One modernizes a core platform. One addresses cybersecurity and resilience weaknesses. One streamlines an internal process that consumes large amounts of staff time. All of them can be linked to strategy. All of them can be defended. All of them may even be important. So now what does strategic alignment actually do for you? Very little, unless the strategy has enough sharpness to say not only what matters, but what matters more under current conditions and why. That is the second problem. Strategic alignment often tells you that something fits the direction, but not whether it deserves priority over something else that also fits. And because of that, the real work of prioritization often shifts elsewhere, sometimes without being acknowledged. It shifts into perceived urgency, sponsorship power, risk aversion, budget timing, executive attention, or narrative force. Meanwhile, the language of strategy remains present, giving the process legitimacy without doing the full explanatory work. This is one reason portfolio conversations can feel strangely thin. Everyone uses serious words: strategy, transformation, value, alignment, capability, modernization. But the actual basis of choice may still remain partly hidden. And when that happens repeatedly, strategy starts to become ceremonial. Not entirely empty, but less operational than it appears. Another issue is inflation. Certain words become so attractive in portfolio settings that they lose precision through overuse. Strategic, critical, transformational, enterprise-wide, future-proof, foundational. These words begin as meaningful distinctions, but if too many projects claim them, they become less like categories and more like badges of aspiration. Soon, every initiative is presented as necessary, urgent, and significant. And once everyone is strategically critical, nobody really is. This inflation matters because language shapes attention. If a portfolio cannot distinguish clearly between different levels and kinds of strategic importance, then challenge becomes harder. Nobody wants to be the person who says, actually, this initiative may be useful, but not truly strategic, if the culture treats that almost as an insult. So strategic language becomes sticky. Projects collect it and then keep it. There is also a social advantage to calling something strategic. It raises the status of the work. It protects it. It signals seriousness. It can improve access to funding, visibility, and sponsorship. It can help a project travel upward in the organization. So there are strong incentives to speak strategically, even when the underlying case is more modest, more local, or more operational. Again, this does not require bad intent. It is often enough that people know strategic language is the language the institution respects. That means portfolio theater is not usually created by liars. It is often created by incentive structures. If the organization listens most carefully to what sounds strategic, then people will learn to describe their work in strategic terms. This is one reason I think mature portfolio governance requires not less strategy language, but better strategy language, more precise language, more differentiated language. A strategy that says not only what the organization values in general, but how difficult trade-offs should be approached when several valuable things compete. Otherwise, alignment becomes too easy, and the real conflict simply moves underground. Let me make this concrete with a scenario. Imagine an organization has 5 strategic themes: digital service quality, operational efficiency, resilience and security, data-driven decision-making, and organizational agility. Now imagine a new project proposal arrives. It is a reporting and workflow improvement initiative for an important internal process. Its business case says it improves service quality by making operations more reliable, increases efficiency by reducing manual work, supports resilience by improving control and traceability, strengthens data-driven decision-making through better reporting, and enhances agility by standardizing and simplifying the process. In other words, it aligns with almost everything. And perhaps that is not even wrong. The project may indeed contribute in all those ways. But if every good proposal can be connected to several broad strategic themes, then the strategic alignment section of the business case tells us very little. It becomes a rhetorical requirement rather than a serious analytical one. So, what would real strategic discrimination look like? It would mean asking harder questions. Not does this connect to the strategy in some general sense, but which strategic tension does it address most directly? Why this now rather than other aligned options? What would not happen if we chose this? Which strategic commitments are we willing to underserve in order to prioritize this one? What kind of value does it create? Over what time frame? And at the expense of what alternative use of capability? Those questions are less comfortable because they force strategy to act not as a banner, but as a trade-off device. That, I think, is the real test. Strategy becomes meaningful in portfolios when it can support difficult exclusion, not only inclusive description. There is another subtle problem here too. In many organizations, strategic alignment is assessed at the wrong level. A proposal may align with a broad strategic ambition, but still be a poor intervention. For example, an organization may absolutely need stronger digital capability, but that does not mean every digitally flavored project is equally wise. It may need better service quality, but that does not mean every service improvement initiative is well chosen. It may need innovation, but that does not mean every new idea deserves portfolio space. In other words, alignment with the direction does not guarantee quality of response. This sounds obvious, but portfolio language often blurs the distinction. A project that sounds strategically relevant can start to feel strategically necessary. And once that slide happens, the quality of the actual intervention may receive less scrutiny than it should. This is particularly risky with fashionable concepts. AI is a good example today, though there are many others. Once a concept becomes associated with future readiness, modernity, or executive ambition, projects tied to that concept may gain a strategic halo. They begin to look aligned before their actual value, readiness, or feasibility has been examined seriously enough. The same has happened in different periods with digital transformation, cloud migration, data platforms, agile change, automation, innovation labs, customer centricity, and many other appealing themes. A concept becomes strategically charged, and then proposals wrapped in that concept enjoy an interpretive advantage. Again, strategy is not absent here, but it is no longer doing all the work people think it is doing. So, how can organizations reduce this drift into theater? The first step is to accept that strategy does not automatically become operational merely because it exists. A strategy document is not a portfolio filter. It becomes a filter only if leaders are willing to use it in ways that create meaningful differentiation. The second step is to be stricter about the word strategic itself. Not everything valuable is strategic. Some things are important, necessary, prudent, overdue, operationally essential, locally beneficial, or risk-reducing without being strategically central. That is perfectly fine. In fact, portfolios become healthier when they have a richer vocabulary of value rather than trying to push everything upward into the same category. If every proposal needs the strategic label to be taken seriously, then governance is already too narrow. The third step is to separate contribution from priority. A project may contribute to strategy without deserving top priority. That sounds simple, but many business cases collapse those two ideas into one. They imply that because the initiative supports the strategy, it should therefore be funded now. But contribution is not enough. The question is comparative contribution under current constraints. The fourth step is to create better challenge questions in portfolio forums. Not just how does this align with strategy, but what other strategically aligned work would be delayed if we do this? What makes this a better expression of strategy than alternative options? Are we using strategy here to choose or only to justify? If the strategy language were removed from this proposal, what would still make it compelling? That last question can be especially revealing. If the strategic language were removed, would the underlying case still be strong? Sometimes yes, absolutely. Sometimes the answer is much less clear. There is also leadership responsibility here. Leaders need to resist the temptation to let strategic language become a substitute for explanation. When senior people repeatedly describe many different initiatives as strategic without showing how trade-offs are being made, they may unintentionally weaken the portfolio's interpretive discipline. They may create an environment where strategy sounds important but feels uninformative, and that can have a cultural cost. People begin to hear strategic language as a ritual. They stop expecting it to clarify. It becomes something that has to be said rather than something that helps make sense of choices. Once that happens, the organization may continue speaking strategy fluently while quietly relying on other forces to actually determine the portfolio. That is why I use the word theater. Not to mock strategy, but to warn against what happens when a meaningful language becomes too ceremonial. Theater is not necessarily falsehood. It is a structured display, a performance of seriousness, a way of showing that something important is happening. And in portfolios, strategy can sometimes function exactly like that. It gives the process dignity and coherence, even when the actual selection logic is more mixed, more political, and less explicitly owned. A mature portfolio should aim for something better. It should not abandon strategy, but deepen it. It should make strategy precise enough to help with trade-offs, honest enough to admit competing values, and modest enough not to pretend that alignment alone resolves prioritization. Because at the end of the day, strategy is not most useful when it allows every project to say yes. It is most useful when it helps the organization explain why some valuable things still have to wait. That is hard. It is much harder than writing a strategic alignment section in a business case. But it is also where portfolios become real. So let me close with the core argument. Strategic alignment is an important idea, but in many organizations it becomes too broad, too easy to claim, too difficult to challenge, and too rhetorically useful to function as a serious filter. When that happens, strategy does not disappear, but it risks becoming theater, a language of legitimacy that accompanies decisions more than it explains them. A healthier portfolio is not one that uses the word strategy more often. It is one that uses it more carefully. Thank you for listening. In the next episode, I want to stay with this issue of apparent rationality and move into one of the most familiar tools in the portfolio world, prioritization. Because prioritization sounds objective, but very often the scoring models, criteria, and numerical comparisons create a kind of false confidence. So next time, I want to ask a deliberately provocative question. What exactly is the problem with prioritization? And before we close, let me leave you with one question for your own organization. When a project in your environment is described as strategic, does that word really help people choose, or does it mainly help people justify what they already want to support?